Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be doing a deep dive on the usage of flaps on the airplanes in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which was requested by Ashley Williams in the comments of a previous video that I made. This is the 5th installment in the Instrument Insights series. In previous videos, I've covered the airspeed, attitude, and altitude indicators, as well as providing an overview of all of the different navigation modes available in the HSI. In this video, I'll be covering how flaps work on an airplane, what they do, and in what different situations you should be using them or not using them. I'll be demonstrating everything in the Cessna 208 Grand Caravan, but the concepts are going to apply to all the general aviation aircrafts in Flight Sim, even if some of the details, such as how much flaps you should use in different situations, will be different per airplane. Alright, let's jump straight into it. Let's start with some of the basics. The flaps on an airplane are located on the wing, just on the inside of the ailerons, closest to the body of the airplane. You can operate them in a few different ways in Flight Sim depending on your keyboard and joystick bindings, but more generally, the actual lever inside of the cockpit is going to be somewhere near the throttle quadrant. In the case of the Cessna 208 that I'm flying today, it's just to the right of the condition lever. By default, you can decrease and increase the flaps with the F6 and F7 keys on your keyboard, and of course you can map it to any keys that you want on your joystick as well. If you'd like to see where I map them for the Logitech 3D Extreme, the T-Flight Hottest, or the TCA Officer Pack, I've made previous videos where I cover how I configure all of the different keys on them, so feel free to check those out. I'll make sure to put links to them in the show notes below. There are a few different types of flaps that you can find on airplanes, but the most common ones that you're going to see are slotted flaps and fowler flaps. Slotted flaps are what you're going to find the most on general aviation aircraft, including the one that I'm showing you right now. The flaps lower from the back edge of the wing, and they leave a gap for high pressure air to pass between the flap and the wing. The other type of flap that you'll see used most commonly in airliners are called fowler flaps. They lower off the back edge of the wing just like the slotted flaps do, and they have that same gap for high pressure air to pass from the bottom part of the wing to the top part of the wing. The difference is that they can extend even further down since there's a part of the flap that's on a rail or tracks. The bottom line though is that regardless of the type of flaps being used on the airplane that you're flying, they operate in the same way and they have the same purpose: to increase the amount of lift that's being generated by the wing. That extra lift comes at the price of increasing drag as well, but in some situations, like when you're coming into land, that can actually work in our favor. I'll get airborne now and we'll have a look more in detail as to why it can be useful for the wings to generate more lift and drag. The first place you end up using flaps is not too surprisingly at takeoff. Usually for takeoff, you'd use something between 5 and 15 degrees of flaps, which is significantly less than you would use for landing. The reason for this, of course, is that the airplane is going to get an increase in lift without generating nearly as much drag as a higher flap setting would. That extra lift is going to translate into a lower takeoff speed and a shorter runway distance needed to get into the air. At the airport that I'm at right now, it's not a big deal because I've got a ton of runway in front of me. But if you're at a short field or at a soft field where you've got either grass or dirt, you're going to need to get airborne a little bit sooner and in that shorter distance as much as possible. And using the flaps could make the difference between a successful takeoff and a failed one. Oftentimes, takeoff flaps is really just going to be the first notch that you can lower the flaps to, but if you look at the throttle quadrant and you inspect it closely, you might be able to see how many degrees that actually is. And if you can't, you can always go to the external view where you'll actually be able to see it in the right-hand side of the heads-up display. And if you're really lucky, like I am flying the Cessna 208, you're going to see it's actually going to be indicated on the flap lever where I should set it for takeoff and where I should set it for landing. If you're looking for even more details, such as how much flaps you should use on a short or soft field takeoff, your next best bet is to try and find a copy of the Real Pilot's Operating Handbook for the airplane, and you'll be able to find all the information you need in there. It can be a little bit dense to search through, but the easiest way to find what you're looking for is to find a section called Normal Operations or something similar to that, and then look for Takeoff. And you should be able to see what's recommended for a normal takeoff and what's recommended for a short field takeoff. One last thing to be aware of for takeoff is that as you get airborne and you're getting ready to retract the flaps, you're going to notice that when you do, the nose is going to want to dip down. That's because when we retract the flaps, we're going to lose that extra lift that we were getting from them. And that reduction in lift is going to result in the nose wanting to drop down. You have to correct for that by first pulling back slightly on the joystick as you retract the flaps to maintain your pitch, And then you're going to want to use the trim so that you can release that back pressure that you've got on the stick. All right, I'm gonna skip forward again a little bit until I've reached my cruise altitude, where I'm going to demonstrate a little bit more clearly what happens when we add and remove flaps with the lift and the drag. Before I move on, I do want to remind you, if you get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit that like button. And if you're one of the majority of people watching this video who haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. Now that I'm flying straight and level at about 3,000 feet, I'm gonna slow the airplane down so that I can show you a few different behaviors that happen when we extend and retract the flaps. I'm gonna start by pulling back on the throttle and adjust my pitch to maintain my altitude while the airplane continues to decelerate. You can only extend the flaps once you're going below a certain airspeed, and the easiest way to know what that airspeed is to have a look at the airspeed indicator. You're going to notice there's a white arc that's going to appear as you continue to slow down on the airspeed indicator. Once your airspeed drops down into that white range, you can at minimum extend the first notch of flaps. For the subsequent flap notches, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to figure out at what airspeed you can extend them at. Like I was saying earlier, on some airplanes, it'll be right next to the flap lever in the cockpit, but oftentimes you'll need to search through the pilot's operating handbook or any other resource that you can find online with that information. When I extend the first level of flaps, you're going to notice the immediate effect it has is to pitch the nose up rather drastically. That's because extending the flaps makes the wing produce a lot of extra lift, which has the effect of lifting the nose and causing a gain in altitude if you don't correct for it. Flap deflection of up to 15 degrees, like I've just done here, is going to generate a lot of lift with just a little bit of additional drag. And that's why you'd use this type of flap setting for a takeoff. I'm gonna keep going and add full flaps here, which will take us to a full 30 degrees of deflection. Again, there's an initial balloon effect that lifts the nose up towards the sky, but once I correct for that, you're gonna notice that the other effect it's having is it's drastically dropping my airspeed. That's because along with the extra lift that's being generated, it's also generating a lot more drag past 15 degrees of deflection, and it's going to have the effect of slowing the airplane down. Everything is reversed when it comes to retracting the flaps. Instead of the nose wanting to balloon up, it's actually going to want to dip down because the wing's going to be generating a lot less lift than it was when it had more flaps. You need to be careful when you retract the flaps to be ready to correct for any reduction in lift by pulling back on the stick, and it's also why you should never retract the flaps when you're close to landing. Let's look at that a little bit more in detail as I'm coming into land. On a typical landing, you're going to use full or close to full flaps depending on the airplane and weather conditions that you're flying in. Full flaps is going to maximize the amount of lift and drag that the wing can produce, and that's going to translate into a few different advantages for landing. First of all, the extra lift that's being generated is going to lower the stall speed of the airplane, and that's going to allow you to have a lower landing speed. A lower landing speed means you're going to need less runway length once you're actually down on the ground and you're trying to come to a complete stop, which becomes especially important when you're landing at shorter backcountry runways. Finally, the extra drag is going to allow you to fly a steeper descent angle to the runway at a slower airspeed than you could achieve without flaps. Typically, you're flying a 3-degree descent rate, and being able to do it just that little bit slower gives you just a little bit more time to prepare for your landing. As you get close to the runway, adding flaps can destabilize your approach because suddenly the wing's going to generate more lift and drag. So you want to avoid to make changes to the flaps when you're below 500 feet and you're getting really close to the ground. You just won't have enough time to restabilize the airplane. What you definitely don't want to do is to retract the flaps if you're undershooting the runway. That's going to suddenly decrease the amount of lift that's being generated by the wing, and it's going to cause the airplane to sink even more rapidly, which is the opposite of what you want. There's one other situation where you need to take care of what flap setting you're using for landing, and that's when there is a strong crosswind. A full flap configuration is great to slow the airplane down, but it's actually going to make your controls a little less effective and a little bit more sluggish. In a crosswind situation where you have to correct on final a lot to stay aligned with the runway, you're best to fly that little bit faster on final approach with less flaps to increase the effectiveness of the controls. For example, in that situation in the Cessna 208, I'd likely use 15 degrees of flaps rather than full flaps. With all of that in mind, you should have all of the basic information you need to get started using flaps in Microsoft Flight Simulator. As usual, if you got some value from this video, please make sure to hit the like button and hit subscribe if you haven't as well. See you in the next video.